Good morning, everyone. I am Rebecca Vickers, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Unresolved Childhood Trauma and the Connection to Substance Use with Dr. Byars. The webinar is being made available through collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the lower right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on FADA's website within 30 business days after the evaluation closes. To access the recording and PowerPoint, go to www.fada.org, then to our Resource Center, and then on to our training library. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on FADA's website. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as a part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Thursday, November 18th. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. Dr. Byars is a licensed professional counselor and a nationally certified counselor and has a private practice focused on trauma and addiction. She is a nationally recognized speaker on the topics of addiction, trauma, anxiety, and ambiguous grief. Dr. Byars has also written extensively on the topic of trauma, addiction, and grief. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody, to the presentation, Unresolved Childhood Trauma and its Connection to Substance Use. I'm excited to get to present this to you. Just wanted to let you know as we go through the slides, I will be reading the information on the slide, but I'll also be adding more information to it. So I want to make sure you can see that you don't have to read every word, but I will be covering what's on there in addition to adding some information. Also, at the end, I think we will have some time for some questions. So if you want to hold on to those until the very end, and then we will answer them as we can. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. These two quotes really stand out and summarize what I'm going to cover today. The first one must not look hard to see we are losing the battle against addiction. The second one, and I'll come back to this one multiple times, if complex PTSD were ever given its due, the DSM would shrink to the size of a thin pamphlet. And when I refer to complex PTSD throughout this presentation, it is synonymous with the unresolved trauma. I'll be using those two words interchangeably throughout. Our learning objectives. We're going to understand the co-occurring prevalence of substance use and trauma. We're going to identify ways unprocessed trauma manifests itself. I'm going to describe how substance use ameliorates trauma symptoms. And we're going to identify ways to help clients with trauma become aware of, which is key, and change these coping strategies. And I'm going to describe different approaches for helping clients become aware of and process this trauma. First, I'm going to talk about the overview and statistics, and I'm going to cover a little bit on substance abuse. And I'm going into this knowing that most of y'all have a basic understanding of substance abuse and addiction. Then I'm going to go into trauma and some of the manifestations and what we'll see clinically or in practice, and then talk about treatment. First, substance abuse and some stats. There is a 40 to 60% relapse rate in individuals with substance use disorders after completing treatment. Now, this stat varies depending on the literature you look at, but across the board, once people get clean and quit using, they have about a 50% chance of relapsing and going back into use. So for every addict or substance user that gets clean, they have a 50% chance of returning to use. The missing piece. About 70% of those who have an addiction or substance use disorder have a history of trauma exposure. This quote is perfect and explains how it goes together. Ritualized, compulsive, comfort seeking. What we call addiction is actually a normal response to the adversity experienced in childhood. It's just like bleeding is a normal response to being stabbed. In essence, those who have had trauma as a child, they want to be comforted later, and seeking addiction or rituals or compulsive behavior is a normal response. I'm going to talk about the disease model of addiction, which is what most of us are looking at this point, and the field of addiction adheres to. The disease model of addiction says addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite harmful consequences. It's considered a brain disease because drugs change the brain. They change the structure and how it works. This is currently how substance abuse and addiction experts view addiction by the disease model. Here are some of the claimed advantages of the disease model. It counteracts the moral model that blames people for their behaviors. The disease model says it is not their fault. It's claimed that it reduces some of the stigma associated with addiction. The disease model helps to lead to treatment rather than punishment for addiction. Since we've been going with the disease model, instead of sending addicts to jail, we're often inclined more to treat them instead. We're now seeing more funding for research, and it gets attention from Congress since it's now considered part of the disease model. Locating addiction in the brain leads to new medications that target brain functioning to help people recover. And finally, one of the advantages of the disease model is that it's a chronic nature of the disease puts relapse into perspective. It lets us see that it can and often will happen. There's also criticisms of the disease model. By labeling addiction as a disease, it offers some false hope that there's a medical cure for substance abuse. It really has not been shown to reduce stigma for addiction. People are still stigmatized as being addicts or substance users and labeled as such. It's based on the premise that drugs are inherently addicting. Although there's conflicting evidence, the research has mostly disproven this. There's only a few drugs that are inherently physiologically addictive. It doesn't adequately account for the reality that people use substances to numb emotional pain or cope with difficult environments. So with the disease model, it's helped us come a lot of ways with treating addictions, but there's still some limitations, and it limits our treatment of people with addictions. There's still stigma, and it doesn't adequately say people still use drugs for pain, and we need to treat that underlying pain. So has anything changed? The very nature of addiction challenges society's deeply held preconceptions about willpower and self-control. Addiction is definitely not a moral failing. It is a disease in which essential motivational and self-control systems of the brain are compromised. Addiction does change the brain. It does change motivation. It is a disease. It is progressive. There is relapse. There is back and forth, and it does have to have treatment. These are all things we know. And here's what's different, and here's where I'm presenting on. When you look at the scale of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, what we have found is that people who have used substances or current substance users, 95% of them have experienced at least 5 ACEs in their childhood. Of these 95%, these are the percentages of what they've experienced. These are some of the most common. 11% recurrent and severe physical abuse. 11% severe emotional abuse. 22% contact sexual abuse. 24% growing up with alcoholic or drug user. Essentially, that means 1 in 4 addicts grew up in an alcoholic home. 3%, they grew up with a family member in prison. 19% grew up with a family member with a mental illness. Grew up seeing their mother being treated violently, 12%. And growing up with both parents not being present, one parent being gone. So about 1 in 4. And so what we found if 90% of them have 5 ACEs, they have several of these grouped together. These are the most commonly found among substance abusers, that they experienced adverse childhood experiences that created pain and trauma. And up until now, we haven't really looked at the impact that this trauma has caused to lead them to use substances. Just some correlations here, some stats. People with an ACE score of 5 or higher are 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs, report substance use, and inject illegal drugs. Trauma, when it occurs, and when I say trauma, all of these that I just covered on the ACE, and there's more on the ACE scale. Trauma causes neurological changes in the brain, which increases the likelihood of abusing substances, whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, heroin, and cocaine. And I'm going to throw in a side right here. Process addictions are also extremely common in people who have had trauma occur. The brain is actually changed when people experience these traumatic experiences, which are exemplified, named, labeled in the ACE questionnaire. So maybe it's not necessarily the substances, and this is a new way and the new take of looking at it. Maybe it's not the substances that are causing the problem, but maybe it's us. And here's the quote. Our findings are disturbing to some because they imply that the basic causes of addiction lie within us and the way we treat each other, not in drug dealers and dangerous chemicals. They suggest that billions of dollars have been spent everywhere except where the answer is to be found. So when we start looking at trauma and addiction and link, we start to see that it is the neurological changes and the pain caused from the traumatic childhoods that has caused the pain that needs to be numbed with the substances and the process addiction. And this is just a simple touch on the literature that's out there. There's hundreds and hundreds of studies conferring that those with the substance abuse have had traumatic childhoods. Sometimes they remember, sometimes they don't. So why the connection? There's essentially 3 hypotheses for this connection. The first one is the self-medication hypothesis. And this one says that people with PTSD use substances in an attempt to cope or counteract their symptoms. And their symptoms being the pain, depression, anxiety, suicidality. The second hypothesis is the high-risk hypothesis, that people who abuse substances have higher rates of trauma as a result of their substance abuse, usually due to lifestyle choices associated with substance abuse. The third hypothesis is the susceptibility hypothesis. People who use are more susceptible to developing trauma, PTSD, after exposure to trauma than those who do not use substances. And what the research is finding about these 3 is that the self-medication hypothesis is the most accurate. And I'm going to go back to those so we can reread which one that one is. It means that they use the substances to cope or counteract with the pain and their symptoms. And you're going to hear me say that over and over throughout this presentation. There is some evidence for the high-risk hypothesis. There's no evidence to support the susceptibility hypothesis. Those who specialize in trauma contend that trauma is stored in the body. Remember the notion that there are neurological changes. It's also, there are changes in the body, and it is stored in the body. And the substance use numbs the pain of the unprocessed trauma. The trauma remains in the body until we become aware of it and it's processed. And until then, the substances are used to numb it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma. I'm going to move on to more of trauma here. So when I talk about trauma, we have this big circle here of complex trauma called complex PTSD or CPTSD. And throughout this presentation, that's mostly what I'm referring to. We also have PTSD and attachment disorder. I'm going to cover each of these. But as you can see in this picture, they're tied together because they all have characteristics in common. And often people have all three. And when you have complex PTSD, you also have an attachment disorder. And I'll get to that in a second. But this graph explains that these three syndromes, these three types of trauma, they overlap. So first, a little bit about PTSD. It was originally recognized in the mid-1980s due to data from Vietnam vets readjustment study. PTSD was originally looked at from war. People came back from war and they were traumatized. It was classified as anxiety in the DSM-3, 4, and 4 revised. In the DSM-5, it got moved out of the anxiety chapter and into the trauma and stressor-related disorders, which is where it belongs because anxiety is a symptom of PTSD, and PTSD is actually a result of trauma and stress. And then there's complex PTSD. It originally came from Judith Herman, who said there's people with trauma that we can't explain. They have more symptoms than what you find in PTSD. So she proposed the notion of the complex trauma. And it's a view of psychological trauma that did not conform to all of the framework of PTSD, and it was seen in people who suffered from domestic violence, child physical and sexual abuse, and neglect, and these people who had this complex trauma were often given the diagnosis of various personality disorders. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So this is very important. Some of the key differences between PTSD and CPTSD, or the key difference, is that PTSD is a mental health issue that occurs when people live through a specific, isolated, or 1 or 2 time traumatic events that have a definite time limit, or in many cases only happen once. This type of trauma is not interpersonal in nature, generally. Examples: watching a bomb go off, watching something explode, being in a car wreck, even having somebody die. It's a one-time event. It's a different interpersonal nature. Being involved in a war, one-time event. Complex PTSD is a result of exposure to trauma over long periods of time and multiple events, often during childhood, but it can also happen in adolescence and adulthood. The trauma is interpersonal in nature, meaning it's between 2 people. It's the difference between being in one car crash and having a childhood to where you are emotionally neglected or emotionally abused. One time for PTSD, multiple times for complex PTSD. So complex PTSD, so when I'm talking about unresolved trauma, This is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about PTSD as much, although PTSD can certainly lead to substance abuse. People with PTSD are generally more aware that they have that PTSD. More on that in a little bit. Complex trauma domains of impairment. Attachment. They don't attach well to other people. Affect regulation. They can have difficulty expressing anger appropriately, sadness appropriately. Behavioral control. Biology, dissociation, cognition, and self-concept. Again, I'll be going through all of these throughout the presentation. And people with complex trauma don't have all of these, but they have some of them. So attachment trauma basics. So we all know that kids need to attach to a caregiver. We have theories on this. We know what happens whenever children don't attach. So they have a biological instinct to attach. It provides a secure base. We learn how to modulate our affective states through our attachment relationship with a primary caregiver. When this is impaired or an absent caregiver doesn't provide a secure base, the insecurely attached child grows up to be an insecurely attached adult. So that's attachment trauma, basic 101. So what complex trauma is, or complex PTSD, is an attachment disorder at its root. So emotional neglect is at its root, with or without physical abuse. A child has no one in its formative years to model relational skills that lead to intimacy. Side note here. So what we have found is that children can go through complex traumas and abuse and neglect, but if they do have an attachment with a caregiver, they may not develop complex PTSD or this unresolved trauma that we're speaking of. But generally speaking, there is not an attachment there, even outside of the family, for them to develop, foster, seen, or feel heard by. When healthy relating is not modeled, survivors do not know how to maintain or find relationships. They begin to believe people cannot be depended on or trusted, and this may or may not be conscious. They become over-reliant on their F preference to avoid true intimacy. Their F preference is our body's natural survival instinct in times of danger. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So essentially, when kids don't have an attachment with emotional neglect or abuse at their root, they can go into the survival instinct state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and they eventually over-rely. I'll be going over this in a lot of detail. Substance use disorder as an attachment disorder. Research has shown the prevalence of insecure attachments in adults with substance use. People who use substances and become addicts and meet the criteria for substance use disorders are insecurely attached 85% of the time. Attachment theory looks at substance use as both a consequence and a failed solution to a paired ability to form emotionally regulated relationships. Underlying driving force behind all compulsive addictive behavior is related to an inability to manage relationships. Side note here, it is relationships that heal. It is relationships that heal complex PTSD. It is relationships that heal attachment disorders. Relationships help to heal substance abuse. But because of the nature of the pain and the wound, people who have suffered these things don't see people as trustworthy or worthy or themselves worthy of devoting time into relationships. Therefore, they numb the pain with the substances. The vulnerable individual's attachment to chemicals serves both as an obstacle and as a substitute for relationships. The impact of trauma. In the moment of trauma, the body goes into fight or flight mode. There's a loss of executive function, and it's into a protective response because cognition is too slow. So I want you to think about this for a second. If somebody walks into a room with a gun, we all have one of four responses: fight, flight, or freeze. What is your natural inclination? Somebody walks into a room with a gun. Do you try to fight them for the gun? Do you freeze and stop? Or do you flight, run away? We all have a natural preference of what we do. In the moment of impact of trauma, whatever a person's natural executive function process is, they go into that state. We don't consciously think to ourselves to do something. It is our body's natural reaction. When somebody who has been repeatedly traumatized, when they are re-traumatized, the brain responds in the same way. The cognitive brain deactivates, the emotional instinctual brain acts as if the traumatic event is happening in the present. The person becomes furious, terrified, enraged, ashamed, frozen, runs away, gets angry. Again, fight, flight, or freeze. And this is repeated over and over and over for children who are traumatized, for adolescents that are traumatized, for adults that are traumatized. And this is such an important concept to remember to grasp the rest of this. So somebody's traumatized, they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. Then it repeats over and over and over to where the brain immediately relies on this, what we call F function: fight, flight, freeze. And there's another one, but it's learned, fawn. I'll go back to that information in a little bit. So I want to talk more. This is a differentiation between complex PTSD and PTSD. There's implicit versus explicit flashbacks. In PTSD, regular PTSD, we have what most of us think of as flashbacks. Remembering the fire, envisioning the car wreck, envisioning the light right before, the impact right before. These are remembrances, flashbacks into the state, into the traumatic event. In complex trauma, the flashbacks are implicit. And these are my words before I read the screen. It is moving back in time into that feeling state of when the trauma occurred. And it is prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of the trauma experienced as a child. When I say child, it can be adult, adolescent. These states can include, but are not limited to, fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. These emotional flashbacks trigger unnecessary fight and flight. The person is transported back in time, experienced as if it were happening in the present. In an implicit flashback, clients mistakenly believe someone or something in the present is causing these feelings. So it takes many years generally for somebody with complex PTSD to realize that they do this, that they go back in time to an implicit flashback, a state that reminds them of their childhood or their abuse or when they were endangered for periods of time. And they stay in these implicit flashbacks for hours to years. Another feature we see with just complex PT, mostly with complex PTSD, is what we call left brain dissociation and right brain dissociation. And this is a way of avoiding the pain. Left brain dissociation, essentially turning off the left side of the brain, is obsessiveness, cycling through worries, dwelling on one worry, constantly thinking to unconsciously distract from underlying pain. Examples: what am I going to wear tomorrow? What am I going to do tomorrow? Where am I going to go tomorrow? What time am I going to get there? Who should I be there? What is that? I don't know what that's going to be. What are they going to say to me? This type of obsessiveness. Complaining about trivial or mundane things instead of addressing pain. I don't like that light. I don't like that sky. I don't like that star. I don't like that this. I don't like that. This is left brain dissociation. Trivialization, focusing on trivial, superficial, external concerns to distract from inner concerns. You see this with highly intellectual people. They can have a preoccupation with sports statistics, the news, politics. This ties into intellectualization, an over-reliance on reasoning to avoid looking at and dealing with feelings. These are some of the cognitive aspects or distortions we see with complex PTSD. We also see right brain dissociation in people who have had trauma. And this is the typical dissociation that we think of when we think of dissociation. The right brain they turn it off. Classical, numbing, intense feeling, or an incessant inner critic, which I'll talk about. Dissociation is a process of distraction, fantasy, daydreaming, la la land, fogginess, TV, tiredness, video games, recounting of long, elaborate dreams devoid of emotional contact and serious introspection. This is part of the brain changes with trauma. Okay. Identifying unprocessed trauma. Okay, so how do we know if we have somebody who's using substances, or somebody says other addictions like gambling and sex addiction in the chat? Absolutely. All of this applies to that. It applies to process addictions across the board. In fact, I don't have a client come to me with an addiction without assessing for unprocessed trauma. And I don't think I've seen a client with an addiction that doesn't have trauma. So identifying unprocessed trauma. So basics here. I already said it, a little bit of an overview. When we're in danger or threatened, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. Our survival instincts respond with one of four responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Again, it's helpful to know what yours are, so that way you can know what generally how you circulate through them, and you can know what a healthy response is in general. Fawn is more of a learned response, and it's a pleasing response. Again, the 4F responses become ingrained because it's repeated over and over. People who are traumatized over-gravitate towards one of these responses. As time goes on, this provides their survival and defense mechanism for coping. It's often done at a pre-verbal age. Most certainly, if the trauma was in childhood, by adolescence, that F type is very ingrained. This response helps them survive and helps them survive the trauma, but leaves them limited in learning other ways to respond in life. They can easily become locked into this pattern into adulthood. People who are not traumatized, people with good enough parenting, people without addictions, they'll fluctuate between these manifestations of the F types. We will appropriately recruit fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So here's what it looks like. Healthy people and or healthy use, I don't want to say healthy people, a healthy use of these characteristics. So when we are using our fight instinct, we're assertive, we have boundaries, courage, moxie, we're willing to show leadership. A healthy use of flight is disengagement, healthy retreat, industrious, know-how, perseverance. A healthy expression of freeze is awareness, mindfulness, readiness, peace, presence. Those who are fawn, and again, this is not something we are born with, this is something we learn. So people who are traumatized can sometimes learn that pleasing the abuser, pleasing those who abuse them, knowing what they want, knowing what they need, fawning, groveling, etc., can keep them from being traumatized. And we all need all of these in our lives. And in a healthy situation, we'll use fawn for love and service, compromise, listening, fairness, and peacemaking. So I hope y'all can identify with those. People without a trauma history fluctuate between healthy manifestations of these, and we use them flexibly throughout life. But that's not to say if an emergency or stressful situation comes, we don't respond to one. And I'll share, I'm a flight type. And in times of stress, I busy myself. I become very, very, very busy. And I know that I'm overflighting. I'm overflighting because that's one of the negative aspects of that. So just knowing what you do. So what are some of the distortions of the F types? So what you might see of somebody with unprocessed trauma, or the distortions, they're stuck kind of in their F type, is the fights, they try to really control others. They control and rage. They try to control to connect with people and rage to be safe. Flighters, they try to make things perfect to connect and perfect to be safe. And freezers, they stop. They don't think they'll connect. They don't think they can connect. So they tune out. Wallflower, they're back. They're not talking to anybody. They don't know why people don't talk to you. They may or may not care that people aren't talking to them. Those are freeze. And our fawners are what we would typically consider our codependents. They're going to merge to connect and grovel to be safe. Again, these are the unhealthy manifestations. And again, if you see these in clients, you may be dealing with some unprocessed trauma. Be on the lookout for them. Some of the factors that influence F-type is the type of abuse and its pattern on which one, what worked for them to survive their trauma. Did they have to fawn for their younger siblings to get food? Did they have to fawn to not get abused? Or did they have to flight? Did they have to get out of the house? Do they have to do this? Did they have to freeze? Did they have to be invisible for the trauma to stop? So the type of abuse and the response it got, their F pattern was often chosen on what worked, what was survival. Their birth order, the older children are often fawners, often trying to save the youngers, and genetic predispositions. Like I said, the question I gave you early, what is your natural instinct whenever you are faced with a dangerous situation? That is probably your genetic predisposition. What do? Are you going to fight when the shooter comes in? Are you taking off? Are you running? Are you just freezing? We all have a genetic predisposition. But those that are traumatized learn to use the one that saved them from the trauma. Okay, so clients don't come to us or patients saying, I have complex PTSD. It just doesn't happen. But they come to us stuck in an implicit flashback. They come to us with right or left brain dissociation, or stuck in a strong F response, or they come in with a substance abuse. They don't come in saying they have CPTSD. It's too new. There's not enough knowledge about it. So what we might see when they come in, fight types, we may mislabel that. We may initially see them as narcissistic and antisocial. Remember what I said about fight. They fight, they argue, they raise their voice to connect. They try to control to connect. And the same with antisocial. And the way I differentiate, not the only way, but one way, a narcissist from somebody with trauma, first of all, a true narcissist doesn't usually come into counseling. But also, somebody with trauma, they can feel guilt. They can feel some true guilt, maybe not very often, but they feel a little bit of guilt, and they have a little bit of self-awareness. A true narcissist will not have guilt and will not have self-awareness. The same with antisocial. And I say, generally speaking, those two are not going to come into counseling on their own will. Flight types. They're going to present with anxiety. They're going to present with some OCD symptoms. These are going to be some of those compulsive behavioral addictions come in. ADHD, if I have a parent bring a child in saying their child can't sleep and has ADD, I'm going to assess for some trauma. I'm going to look for that. Some bipolar, some up and down, depression, some mania. People with freeze, they may present with some dissociation, tuning out. You'll hear parents say they just won't pay attention in class. They won't listen to the teacher. They won't listen to me. They're a good kid, but they're tuned out. Depression, dysthymia, low-grade long-term depression. Schizotypal, they aren't on the same wavelength with other people. They misunderstand. Asperger's, if I have somebody come in with a client, they have autism. They have autism. ADHD and autism don't exist by any means, but I'm also going to look for some trauma to make sure that they're not stuck in that strong F response. Avoidant, people who are avoiding doing things, avoiding dealing. Are they just stuck? Are they being traumatized? Or they still have unresolved trauma? They could be stuck in that freeze response. And fawn, we see these in counseling a lot. The more dependent personality, trying to make everybody happy. They want to make everybody happy. They don't have much of an identity. They don't know what to do. You're going to see some depression here. They just want to make everybody happy. And they don't know what makes them happy, because they've spent their life fawning off the attacker to stay safe. And in the extreme, you'll see some borderline there. And so that's what I meant when I said a little earlier about misdiagnosis with personality disorder. And sometimes people do have a personality disorder. Generally, they don't come in for counseling. They're harder to get in. So if you have somebody, please, if you think has a personality disorder, dig a little deeper in to see if they're in an F response, and it comes from trauma, because it's out there. It's really, really out there. So the inner critic is big, big. And this is a differentiating quality between PTSD and CPTSD also. People with complex PTSD have an inner critic. Those with PTSD generally don't. And an example of the inner critic is, I'm so stupid, I can't do it. It's essentially what we think of as low self-esteem, but it's an inner voice that is talking them into being useless, that they are useless, that they can't do whatever it is that they want to do or think they should or can do. You're useless, you're dumb, you're stupid, you're fat, you can't, you don't know, you're not worth it, you can't get that job, etc., etc. And it comes in all shapes and sizes. Essentially, this is the disgust, rage, scorn, or neglect the parents felt towards the child, and it's taken on as their own voice. This disgust that their parents or their abuser, it's a better way to put it, takes on their own voice, and it causes shame. Please look at this with all cases of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse or process addiction. I find it helpful to have my clients label to tell them exactly what the inner critic is. Speaking of the implicit flashbacks, people will be stuck. They think their inner critic is their voice. Their MO to themselves that they repeat all the days, you're so stupid. You're so stupid. And they don't realize that that's what that is. But if you can label that for them, they can name it their Satan, they can name it their mojo, they can name it the enemy, they can name it their whatever, their monster. But if they can depersonalize this inner critic that was developed through the trauma. When you have a client with an inner critic that's strong, dig around for some trauma. When I say dig around for some trauma, they may or not know that they've been traumatized. So you have to be careful with that too. And more on that in the treatment section. So how the inner critic develops a little more. So when a child or adolescent victim fails to receive validation or approval, they fail to form this attachment, become anxious and fearful. They adapt by developing hypervigilance and or perfectionism. And these are important concepts, this hypervigilance and perfectionism. And they can think the perfectionistic, seeking, hypervigilant person can only think of how they are not good enough based on other people's parents' words of affection or lack of words and affection. The sense of self has no room to develop and becomes that of the message of their parents they have or have not sent, and the inner critic develops. You see, when there is a healthy attachment, they can develop their own sense of worth through that relationship. When there's no attachment, they rely on the other person's words for affection. And so they think that only if I could be perfect, if only I could be perfect. And a lot of this isn't necessarily conscious, and they're hypervigilant for signs that they've made a mistake. So some examples of inner critic induced flashbacks. So what can happen is clients, people who have trauma unprocessed, or even in the process of processing their trauma, the inner critic, they do something, they spill milk, and every time they would spill or have an accident, their parents would call them a klutz. So it would begin a cycle of you're a klutz, you're a klutz, you're a klutz for long periods of time from an isolated incident of spilling milk that took them back in time to feeling like the little kid that they were. Someone wanting to take a gift to a friend and the gift thinking it inappropriate. So they walking around thinking they're stupid. They infer that it is stupid. And they walk around, they're stupid, they're stupid, they're stupid because they didn't get the response that they thought that they should. I hope that's making sense. So in misspeaking, again, remember with trauma, they think that they have to be perfect. They think they're hypervigilant for nonverbals, that they're not doing things correctly. So if they misspeak and don't get the nonverbals, it can send them into I'm clueless, I'm clueless, I'm clueless. And I've had these examples from clients in multiple ways, probably hundreds of times. But if you can identify what they are, it's their inner critic going back to childhood and what their parents would have said and sending them into a flashback that can last for weeks, months, an hour. So we have an outer critic and we have an inner critic. Those with PTSD also often have an outer critic. So the inner critic views the self as flawed, unworthy, and the outer critic views the rest of the world as flawed and imperfect. I don't like that person. I don't want to talk to that person. I don't want to be around them. I would go if that person wasn't there. I don't want to do that. I don't like that. It's too hot in here. It's too, and there's a difference between a glass half empty and realism and an outer critic. And if you think about it, you'll know what I'm talking about. An outer critic is nitpicking at everything. And it's also very closely related to that left brain dissociation I was talking about, just nitpicking things. And so it uses that same programming of perfectionism and endangerment against others that the inner critic uses against self. So the inner critic says, I must be perfect. The outer critic says, everything else must be perfect. And again, all of this comes from the trauma and thinking if I'm perfect, I won't be traumatized. And so they take that in on themselves and take that on as their own belief. It's a consequence of untrustworthy parents, generalized to relate all others to avoid emotional investment in relationships. The outer critic is it is a relationship and intimacy killer. It makes it, if I have a client with a strong outer critic, it is almost impossible to get them to reach out to other people and to have close relationships with others. It happens. They have to be able to identify that it's an outer critic and work on it. Intimacy in the outer critic. Remember, CPT. Childhood development without the sympathetic caregiver means a child may not understand other people can help with feelings of loneliness or other emotional pain. Drawing on this experience, the outer critic says people are dangerous and cannot meet those needs. The deeply ingrained memories of unsupportive parents stifle the possibility of seeking help and intimacy. And I'll say this again in treatment. There are three big things that you need to heal trauma. There's a lot of other things, but three of the big things are support people, angering, and grieving. And that goes into body work. There's a lot of other domains, but those are the three big things. They have to have people. Even though it's the people that hurt them, it's people that they need to help them, which is so hard for them to get past. The outer critic alienates others. The passive aggressiveness is actually a sign of an outer critic. Parental abuse or neglect naturally makes children angry. They can't, but the power of parents, such that anger can't be expressed. This unexpressed childhood anger becomes a vast reservoir of resentment. It's projected onto others through passive aggressiveness. This is generally unconscious, and resentment is the key word here. The outer critic thrives on the judgmental, condemnation, and hurtful, backhanded behavior. So if you have, and you'll see this probably more in a couples therapy, if you're working with couples, you'll know more about passive aggressive behavior of one spouse to another. Generally, in individual counseling, it can be difficult to see if they are passive aggressive. Most people aren't aware of it, but it does generally come from an outer critic and pent up resentment. So the critic and disassociation and F types. So it's, if you have a client and you can identify they have had trauma, and they get stuck in the freeze type. They dissociate, they isolate, they're depressed. You can also find that they have a stronger outer critic based on this, and they right brain dissociate. And this idea and this information is helpful from a treatment stance. People who tend to go into the fight mode, and you can also validate, cross-reference in your brain. Is this a narcissist, or is this somebody stuck in fight mode? Is this just an outer critic, a really strong outer critic? Do they also left brain dissociate? It's a good chance that this is actually a trauma case versus a personality disorder. And that's not to say that this can't turn into a personality disorder, but in most cases, the root of fight types is pain. The root of personality disorders is pain, but it's fresher and tighter here. Fawn type, what we see is an inner critic, and they'll fluctuate. They'll dissociate between the right and left brain. Flight type, between the inner and outer critics, and they left brain dissociate. Information is also important for treatment. Helping the client become aware, oh, there I go again, I'm left brain dissociating, or oh, there's my outer critic again. It's really going after that, having to go to Thanksgiving with the in-laws, or whatever it is, based, on where they are in recovery. So trauma, let's take our 5-minute break here. I think this is a good time. And then we'll talk about treatment.
That sounds great. We will go ahead and meet back at 11:07, everyone.
Thank you.
right, everyone, we are going to begin again. Dr. Byars, if you are ready, I'm going to pass the presentation over to you.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll just recap. So we've talked about substance abuse and people relapse in substance abuse. There's kind of a missing piece. The disease model has gotten us pretty far, it's really helped and jumped us along. And so we're thinking this is the next big piece that we're missing with treating substance abuse is unprocessed trauma. And we're thinking that because of the very strong correlation, the number of people who use substances and the number of people with trauma. And people don't present to counseling and say, I have trauma. I have unresolved trauma. I have complex PTSD. I have PTSD. I have an attachment disorder. This is more what we have to put into our tool bag, is that if somebody comes in with substance abuse or an addiction or a process addiction, I'm going to take it further into depression, anxiety, even a personality disorder. Trauma is very, very likely the missing piece. And so far, I've talked about some of the things that you need to be looking for. Right and left brain dissociation, an overdeveloped F-type, some responses that are too strong for a situation, which would be an implicit flashback where they were sent back into the trauma days. So everything I've said up until now are kind of clues that you're dealing with somebody with unprocessed trauma. And so you can get at and look at and ask, do you have trauma? Tell me about and still people won't realize and may not be able to come to their own idea that they have been through trauma, because trauma has so many different faces. And a lot of trauma happens at the pre-verbal level to where they can't cognitively pull it up. So I'm going to make the case that from here on out, we need to have trauma-informed treatment, even if we're dealing with a client that we don't know if they have trauma. Because it doesn't hurt, it doesn't change much, it doesn't, chances are really good. Remember the very opening quote I said from the leading traumatologist is that if unrecognized and undiagnosed trauma was recognized and treated, the DSM would shrink. And this is more of a going to the wound. We still need to treat the substance abuse. We still need to treat the anxiety. We still need to treat the depression, the OCD, the ADD, all of these things. But the original wound may be the trauma, the pain from the trauma. So I'm going to talk some about what trauma-informed treatment looks like. And so it requires a paradigm shift away from, not completely away, but just a little bit away from traditional substance abuse treatment, toward one that utilizes principles of trauma-informed care. Remember, CPTSD is a learned set of responses. It results in the inability to complete some developmental tasks. And I'm going to pause there. They didn't learn appropriate use of their F responses is part of it. So if you take a client that doesn't have a good fight response, the chances of being re-traumatized or abused are very high. If you have someone with a very strong fawn response, the chance of being re-traumatized is high. They didn't develop these things. So it's important to keep in mind that, and we think of Erik Erikson's stages of development. Some stages, they just weren't met because of the trauma and the brain altering. It is environmentally not genetically caused. And this often differentiates it from other diagnoses. Treatment is influenced by the mechanisms individuals have been using to cope. Their addiction, their sleeping too much, their eating disorder, their depression, their anxiety, their substance abuse, their, I think, stuff, the sex addiction, the shopping, the gambling, all of these things. We need to take those, the things that they've been using to cope, their F-type, and their inner and outer critic stance are critical for recovery. We need to keep in mind that some of the treatment things we use, especially in substance abuse, can be re-traumatizing. And if there's one principle you take away about trauma-informed treatment, it is to not re-traumatize the client. To not re-traumatize the client. People who have had trauma are about 20 times more likely to experience another trauma. The brain has been altered, and these F responses are very readily available, and they use them very quickly to send them down into another trauma trigger. So some of these, the list I have here is some AA things that they encourage, and I'm not an anti-AA person. I think it just needs to be put into context of sometimes things that can be re-traumatizing for trauma people seeking substance abuse treatment is this concept of powerlessness. People who have had trauma, they need to feel powerful. They for the most part. So telling them to feel that, say they're powerless over their addiction is not going to be helpful a lot of times. That the counselor or the helper is the absolute authority. They need a reciprocal relationship. They need a therapeutic relationship. They need a relationship above all. Remember the three big things I said that heal are relationships and people and grieving, and in some cases angering. Okay. Confrontation tactics can send them into a flashback and trigger their F response. Shaming practices can be re-traumatizing. Focusing on character defects. Well, you're just not good at that. Well, you're just not good. A lot of people with trauma can't do that yet. A lot of people with trauma, if you're going to look at the fawn types that don't have their identity fully developed, that's kind of the developmental task that they're going to be missing. They're not ready to look at that. They can't look at that. And that will be re-traumatizing to them. Saying addicts can't be trusted to tell the truth. Discharging for non-compliance. Punishing aggression. Remember, I said angering is therapeutic for people with trauma in a safe way. They need to get angry for what's happened to them. Yeah, we shouldn't punish aggression. We shouldn't encourage aggression. We need to encourage healthy angering. Not giving clients choices can be re-traumatizing. And withholding medication-assisted treatment can be re-traumatizing. Remember, their brain has changed. Their brain has changed from the trauma. And if they've been using substances, their brain may well have changed from that. 12-step programs, AA, they can be valuable and an adjunct to some of the evidence-based safe treatments. The relationship-based program of recovery can be both healing and triggering to a traumatized individual. And I think it's important that we just let them know this, that we keep them informed. And in order to do this, we need to first make them aware of the trauma and what the trauma means and what being re-traumatized could mean in your way of doing that. Unwillingness to participate is a common and expected reaction of someone who has experienced trauma in relationships. It is hard for people with a trauma history to do AA. It is. To get treatment or to get help or denial about the substance, this is trauma. This is the distrust of people that is not just common, but part of complex PTSD and unresolved trauma. Relationships are dangerous to them, but what is damaged in relationships can only be healed in relationships. And so that's what we're up against as helpers. So let's start with the healthy, safe relationship with us. Implications for treatment. It's no longer adequate to treat substance use as the primary or singular disorder. It's important to critically examine how we do substance treatment today, be willing to change our practice so we are responsive to what they have experienced. And before we're responsive, we need to be aware of what they present to us and be open to the notion that there may be something there may be trauma there that they haven't brought out yet. Trauma-informed treatment and trauma-specific interventions must become an integral part of substance abuse treatment. Even clients who do not have a trauma history will respond positively to trauma-informed treatment. So rethinking substance abuse treatments. For many individuals, addictive behaviors are an adaptation to traumatic experiences. And this is addictive behaviors. This isn't even necessarily using of the substances, but the actions and the people they go to and the things they do and the inner critic, letting the inner critic take over and the outer critic. The disease model has its usefulness, but the risk is we seek only to intervene through the brain and ignore the body and the mind-body connection. Remember, trauma is stored in the body. We need to refocus our treatment from the bottom up. And that means we include cognition, we include emotions, and we include the body. It all needs to be in there. As I said, individuals are not going to seek help with CPTSD. And if they do, you're way ahead of the game. And you can go straight right into these F principles, this left and right brain dissociation, when their inner and outer critic comes into play. But otherwise, you're going to be digging around trying to figure out where the trauma is, helping them take care of themselves, developing some awareness of that there may be some trauma there. Until when you have clients come in that don't have a fight response, and you'll see this a lot, they don't stand up for themselves, they let people abuse them, and you'll see this with people who know that they've been abused and they repeatedly get abused and they don't know why they continue to walk into the same type of relationship. They need to develop a fight response awareness of what a fight response is, see if they can develop it. They aren't going to benefit just quite yet from a lot of the cognitive behavioral or psychodynamic therapy just quite yet. And that's often step one with trauma clients, is making sure they have some fight response in them. This is what helps prevent re-traumatization, is the fight response. The cognitive level, developing awareness. Develop awareness of the trauma, develop awareness of what an inner critic is, develop awareness of when their inner critic is talking to them, and to eventually separate from the inner critic. Help the client develop insight into the abuse and neglect pattern. This can be hard. I've seen it. One of the things I've been looking at is some of this in the church environment, where it's very difficult to look at the fact that some of this was abusive and some of this was neglectful. Even though it was under, the church or the religion or the whatever, there was still abuse or neglect there. Into it in a safe, gentle way. Remember, we don't want to re-traumatize them with it. They need to be told very strongly, firmly, they didn't deserve to be treated that way. They didn't deserve that. Introduce them to the F response notion and explain this helped them survive. This is what has helped them keep going up until now with the trauma that they've experienced. But they're safe now. And they don't always have to flee when things get scary. They don't always have to freeze and be invisible anymore. They don't have to always please the person that's speaking to them. They can get in touch with their own thoughts and feelings. Introduce them to the F response, what it does, and how it kept them safe, and how they think it's keeping them safe now, but they don't need that now. At least they don't need that with you. Help them see connection of how they were treated and how they respond to stress. That's where we see it the most, is when people with addiction, substance abuse, across the board, trauma, when they get stressed, they really fall into that strong F response. And they follow the lead of how they were traumatized. They do what was modeled to them. Cognitive healing involves finding more accurate ways of thinking about and talking to oneself. Includes recognizing the source of poor self-perception, placing the blame on the wrongdoers. The cognitive work can be critical in the process of disidentifying from the self-hating critic. So again, for some people, they are their critic. They are the internal critic. That's their mindset. That's how they've always been. That's how they live. They are their parent's voice. And for some clients, once I get the trauma case example, every time she would say something, that's your mom. That's your mom. That's your mom. What are your words for you? That's your mom. That's not yours. And the blame needs to point to who actually did it. That is not their voice. That is not how they see themselves. They need to develop a new schema. So eventually the cognitive tools in CBT are so very important, but they've discovered that it cannot by itself address the full depth of the woundedness. So we have to go with some emotional work too. Cognitive work helps the client disidentify with the critic. Many are so entrenched with their critic, it is a part of them all the time. And I'll add to that, the cognitive work also helps them realize the F type that they use, when they overuse the F type, how the F type helped them survive, and how the F type isn't needed now as strongly. It's not. Focus on those positive qualities of the F type. So reparenting, what I found is, I'll read it first. Reparenting consists of affirmations rather than punishment. Judgment is self-rejecting and counterproductive. Repeated simple mental and verbal affirmations are useful. Reparenting can include self-mothering and self-fathering. And so what we found is that depending on who the abuser was, clients either have a hard time with self-defense or self-care. And sometimes it's a little bit of both. But so if it's a self-defense, that a lack of fight, a lack of standing up for themselves, a lack of not being abused, um, a lot of times it was the father that was the abuser. So they're in need of what we would call self-fathering, of protection instincts. How do you protect yourself? What do you do when someone does that? In what ways do you stand up for just in getting that self-protective instinct in? And then we also have trauma patients who fall in this self-care. They're missing that. And in these cases, a lot of times it was the mother or the female side that was more abusive. And these people have a lot harder time with self-care and a very strong inner critic and no rest, no care, no, and encouraging them to get in touch with what they love to do and to do it. And so that's what's meant by the self-mothering and self-fathering. And if that works for you to label it that way for your client, that's great. But self-mothering is self-care and self-fathering is self-protection. And people with trauma have at least one of those that they need help with. Sometimes it's both. Emotional healing. A strategy for reconnecting with emotional self is through grieving. This is so important. It is so important that they grieve what was lost with the trauma. What was lost, it hurts. It's sad. It shouldn't have happened. If it was a parent, this was somebody they trust. They trusted them so much and they loved them so much, and maybe they still do, that it's so hard to look through. A person can be led through a process of grieving what they have lost because of trauma or neglect. It is a death of part of oneself, which may allow a rebirth of some emotional intelligence. And interestingly, and I see it, grieving quiets both the inner and outer critic and may stop flashbacks in the moment. In sessions with my clients, when I see them in a very strong outer critic attack, this and that and this and that, and they did this and I don't want to see them, and if I can get them to get in touch with the grief and the pain that are underneath the anger of the outer critic, or the anger of the inner critic, it can pull them out of that implicit flashback. If they can grieve and feel, and they don't necessarily have to cry, but to grieve and to feel the pain underneath the critic, because the critic is a buffer for the pain. So grieving. Part of grieving a lot of time is anger. And for some people, they need to get angry as part of their grieving. And it depends on the client, of very strong caution. For some clients, anger can send an individual into a flashback if they were punished for expressing strong emotions in childhood. So if you can figure out the trauma pattern, what they were traumatized for, and sometimes you can get in touch with that, with what their inner critic is telling them, no, bad people get angry, bad people get angry, bad people get angry. And so there you are encouraging them to get angry. And so what does that do? That re-traumatizes them. So you use this with caution. Telling them to get angry. You use what naturally comes, and you hope. You can ask, how did your parents handle anger? How was anger modeled for you? How do you feel about expressing anger? So anger and grieving, both emotionally laden and emotionally healing for people in trauma. But find out what was modeled and their reaction to those different types of feelings. Verbal ventilation. It allows the speaking out of feelings, of painful feelings. Allowing feelings to come out verbally can lead a person out of a flashback by giving voice to the emotions of the hurt child, allowing the adult the child has become to feel the pain. Acknowledged in that way, the pain can be mourned. Verbal ventilation quiets the inner critic. So verbal ventilation is productive sharing. This is when there is a therapeutic relationship and they can talk about the pain and the hurt. And it may be the pain and the hurt of today, or of the trauma, or of the fears of tomorrow. And as clinicians, it's important to differentiate ventilation and, the left brain dissociation. Verbal ventilation is not complaining about the red light on the way here. Verbal ventilation is talking about the feelings related to the trauma and the inner critic and the outer critic and what they're using to numb the current pain. Difference between verbal ventilation and left brain dissociation. You can throw the outer critic in there too. Make sure that that's not working. The inner critic can sometimes resist grieving. Again, you need to make sure we're not re-traumatizing. A common statement in trauma households: quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Grieving and crying may lead an individual into a flashback, recalling words spoken by parents. This is the reason sometimes, once I've identified that it is indeed a case of unprocessed trauma or trauma, how did your parents respond when you cried? How was crying modeled for you? So some trauma survivors have to learn to quiet the inner critic well before they can begin the grieving and angering process. So identify, remember, because the things that were taught by their parents have now been turned into an inner critic. So identify that inner critic, quiet that, and once they can depersonalize that inner critic, then it's easier for them to grieve. But we re-traumatize when we ask them to cry, and they were punished for it. Loneliness. The shame that binds an individual to loneliness must be healed. And remember what I said earlier, it's people that both hurt them and it's people that both heal them. Group work can be effective in healing relational shame. It's more mutual vulnerability in group work compared to one-on-one. And this is definitely in later stages. It can be really hard for people with CPTSD or unresolved trauma to get in a group, at least initially. A lot of times you have to have some of the other cognitive work first. And then for some people, though, they can jump right into group work. But some way to break the loneliness. Mindfulness. And I'm going to call mindfulness and the self-awareness. What we sometimes call the witnessing self or the observing ego. An important tool. Time for genuine reflection and allows the person to distinguish between things they believe and things they have been pressured to believe about themselves. This is one of the hardest things for people with trauma to overcome. What they have essentially been brainwashed to believe by their traumatizers and what they actually believe. And it comes down to developing their own self-awareness versus the awareness that has been instilled in them. And that will break off the outer critic, the inner critic, help to deactivate that strong F response if they can develop this. And this can be, sometimes people can do this on their own at intervals. Sometimes you can tell them, do this for 5 minutes a day. Do this for 1 minute. Or in that instance, what did your genuine self want to do? There are different ways to model this and encourage this type of mindfulness. Awareness of one's self-commentary can be practiced, and with enough practice, one may be able to replace harmful viewpoints with thoughts that are self-supportive. Trauma is stored in the body. All trauma is pre-verbal. Sometimes it's done before the verbal age, but regardless of what age the trauma occurs, it doesn't go into cognitions to where we make sense of it. It's stored within the body, not within the brain. The traumatized body re-experiences terror, rage, and helplessness. But these feelings can be almost impossible to articulate. The things I've talked about thus far are the things they can articulate: the inner critic, the outer critic, the F response, but they cannot articulate what it felt like to be traumatized. Survivors develop cover stories to explain their symptoms and behaviors. These stories rarely capture the inner truth of experience. The experience of trauma shows up in instinctual responses such as fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, which is also considered cement and attach. So educating them on that notion, EMDR, I don't think I have that on a slide, is helpful, very helpful for the trauma stored in the body. This goes back to more of the cognitive work. With the, I'm going to go back to stored in the body real fast. Some other things for the stored in the body, the massages, if they'll let people, yoga will stimulate some nerves and help with soothing the fight, flight, fawn response, the EMDR, body awareness, the meditation. These are all things that can help myofascial release. And if you can find one trained in it, they can tell kind of where body parts are stuck. So this is all body work that has been helpful for people with trauma. And EMDR can be considered cognitive and body work. So a good all around is this notion of good enough. Remember, all of this inner and outer critic is instilled because of this perfectionistic, hypervigilant thinking. You know, this person's not good enough. I'm not good enough. This isn't good enough. Well, then I'm not going to do it. Well, then, you know, this, and having them replace it with good enough. Good enough. Used by scholars to describe the discarding of perfectionistic, unrealistic attitudes towards relationships. It adopts reasonable expectations of good-heartedness and consistency in the support, protection, forgiveness, and comfort one receives from a parent or any relationship. So sometimes it's helpful to have clients just say, what's good enough in my life right now? What's good enough? What's good enough about me? What's good enough? I think that's in here. Avoiding the gratitude gap trap. This is asking people with complex PTSD, unresolved trauma, to find things that are thankful for is very hard for them and can very often send them into flashbacks. So I would just be careful with this, and that what we normally do for gratitude, and present the notion just mentioned of good enough. Many clients, people with trauma, were told, just be thankful. You have so much. You're so spoiled. You're so entitled. Oh, many, many ways that was etched into their brain. Present the notion of finding things that are good enough, and have the client generate things, finding number of things that are good enough versus things to be grateful for. I've across the board found that that's an easier notion for people with trauma to swallow or to think about. Good enough versus thankful. Because when you are in the midst of always being in an implicit flashback with an inner critic that has your soul, you may not be able to pull up things that you're thankful for. But you can often think of things that are good enough. Spirituality. This is another area where we need to be careful that we don't re-traumatize. Just like with the grieving and the angering, it depends on the background with spirituality and religion. How is it phrased for them? How would they like to have that presented, or y'all work on it? But it has great potential in recovery, because this idea of a transcendent sense of belonging can be very attractive. Belonging to something greater, having a sense of place. I've seen it on both ends. I've seen spirituality really help to heal, and I've also seen people steer as far away from spirituality and religion as they can, because part of their trauma included that. So use that based on the client's history, and that again is part of the trauma-informed treatment. Is what's their trauma, what's their F type, what's their critic, inner, outer critic stance. How do you implement the spirituality, or how do you not? There it is, working with the body. Movement-oriented activities should move from the adjunctive therapy list to the primary and incorporate sensory motor approaches. Once the body settles, it makes it easier to work through the emotional and the cognitive modalities to heal trauma. I've had clients sitting in session so tensed up with their shoulders up to their ears, and then just pointing out, just your shoulder, just the body awareness of how tense they are all the time. And if they can have some body work, some activity, something that speaks to them, and develop that body awareness, that makes it a lot easier to do the cognitive and emotional work. So angering and grieving the losses of childhood, it always begins with awareness of the patterns that were established, ingrained from an early age, or where the trauma occurred. With practice, the inner critic can be silenced and recovery made a way of life for those affected by complex PTSD or unresolved trauma. This is a step towards avoiding the need to numb the pain of unprocessed trauma with substances. And so what do you think? So can we change how we approach substance abuse treatment? This could be the other adjunct that could help with the recovery of substances. And so that's the end of my presentation, and I can take questions as you have them if you want to put them in the chat. Okay, I see. Do I have a book out that talks in depth about this? I do not have a book about this. But I think most trauma books, you can search complex PTSD, which is a common topic now. Thankfully people are now recognizing it. So I think you can search that and find some good books with that in there. Thoughts on working with different races. I would say very similar to don't re-traumatize, but hearing their stories and taking into the multicultural stance of asking them to educate us on their culture. Because in our culture, you know, in American, as a Caucasian, there are some things that may happen to me that other cultures may see traumatizing, and vice versa. But, you know, getting their side of the story on what is and what isn't traumatizing. So I think it's important to hear the client's story based on their culture. And that's, you know, and when I say culture, I say, you know, age, race, SES, everything. So if we have these children now, and I'm just going to read off the questions I'm answering, at young ages, say 6 to 10, is what we do now will prevent hopefully turning to substances at a later date age. I love this. Absolutely. Okay, remember what I said, connection is key. I have heard of some really terrible trauma cases, and they did not develop complex PTSD because of that attachment. So what you need to do, they need an attachment. They need an attachment. They need a human. They need a person to see them for who they are so they can develop who they are outside of the trauma. So that would be the key with them. They don't necessarily have to talk about the trauma and process the trauma. In fact, new research is now coming out saying the trauma that's done, it probably isn't going to make sense or be able to be processed 5, 10, maybe even 15 years later. They need a person. They need a person. They need an attachment. How soon in a session should the trauma work begin? The trauma-informed treatment, base it on the client. Base it on the client. And with trauma work, you're less talking about the trauma that occurred. In fact, I often don't talk about the trauma that occurred unless it's to gather information on how was anger treated, how was grieving treated. But the trauma work begins with establishing the relationship. So from the get-go, that relationship is key. We know that. And then identifying that inner critic comes pretty early. Whenever you hear that negative self-talk, helping them to disassociate that. So the child I chatted about is now lying and stealing from his foster family. They are frustrated. Any ideas? And I'm going to say the same thing with children. Love them. Connection. They need a connection. They need a connection, and it's not going to, the foster family is frustrated, angry, hurt. The interactions there are probably not positive. They need somebody, that child needs somebody outside the home that is not asking about the lying and stealing, because the lying and stealing is from the past trauma or pain. So what they need is a human to help heal that pain. So that's where I would go with the child like that. The question about trauma not being stored in the brain because memory is part of the brain. Generally speaking, that's what the research is saying. It changes the brain, changes the size of the hippocampus and a couple of other features, but the trauma is mainly stored in the body. And that's why they can't remember all the details of it. And that is why they have EMDR to help disassociate from it. And that is why people who have CPTSD and PTSD have nightmares, because it is the brain trying to make sense of it, because they can't bring it up. What are my thoughts on trauma yoga? It's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely if people are willing to do that, that can really get people with trauma in touch with their body and their breath. Their breath. I've had some poses, yoga poses, be triggering for some people, so they need to be careful with that. The Body Keeps a Score is an excellent book. Thank you. Yes, that is an excellent one. Meet the client where they are. Yes, definitely. Thank you for the very nice feedback. When people have traumas they haven't discussed for over 20 years, can their trauma be remapped since their brain has been from the alcohol? I think I understand. You know, you have to work simultaneously with that. And I'm not quite sure the question or I'm gonna be able to. They can. I would do with EMDR. There some work can be done, but they need to be aware of the trauma. If they. Okay, so they haven't discovered the traumas. The first step is going to be the relationship and getting in touch with the traumas, or even not necessarily the traumas, but the way they manifest the symptoms of somebody who has been traumatized, such as defaulting to their F-type, the inner and outer critic, the left and right brain dissociation, the numbing, which is what the alcohol is doing. They don't necessarily have to acknowledge the trauma for you to point out the inner outer critic, the left brain dissociation, right brain dissociation, the F types, things like that. And I don't know off the top of my head videos on YouTube.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today. We'd really like to thank Dr. Byars for all of the work you put into this webinar and all the valuable information you've shared with us today. We've included Dr. Byars' information, contact information, so that you may contact her with any further questions. And Dr. Byars, we'd really just like to thank you for all the work you put into today's webinar. A couple of items to note, business of items to note before we leave today. In the chat panel, there is a link to today's survey. Additionally, when I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license, prefix, and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You will need to use the same email address that you used when you registered for today's webinar through our WebEx link when you set up your profile in FADA's system. This will help connect your attendance and your profile. You will also get a second opportunity today to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email. The sender will be messenger@webex.com. Please remember that the evaluation will close at midnight on Thursday, November 18th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially for the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you again so much, Dr. Byars, for all of your information.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.